Hi everyone, you're very welcome. It's 1 o'clock now, so it's time to start the webinar. Good afternoon everyone and welcome. My name is Vivian Hanrahan and I'm the webinar coordinator for the HRB-TMRN webinar series. This is our third webinar of 2019 and we are absolutely delighted to welcome a group here today. It's our first time having three guest hosts on together, so bear with us. I think it's going to be good. The first of those is Brian Slattery, then Laura O'Connor and Stephanie Haugh, who recently successfully completed the HRB-TMRN funded SWAT on examining the influence of an informational video on participant retention in a randomised control trial. So the webinar today is about the reflections on that SWAT and the lessons they've learned. So just a brief introduction to each of our panelists. So first of all, we've got Dr. Brian Slattery. He's an assistant professor of psychology in the School of Nursing and Human Science in DCU. Previously, Brian worked as a postdoctoral researcher in the Centre for Pain Research, the CPR, in NUI, investigating eHealth solutions for people with chronic pain and multimorbidity. It was while doing this work in the CPR that Brian and his colleagues developed and implemented a SWAT for the randomised control trial. Brian's research interests are in eHealth, particularly in the context of self-management of chronic illness, e.g. chronic pain, digital behaviour change, user engagement, technology design, and more broadly in health and behavioural psychology. And then our next guest speaker is Laura O'Connor. She's a research assistant with the Centre of Pain Research as well. She joined the centre in 2014, and following completion of her Masters in Information Technology, she's also worked primarily on the eHealth related projects. She's designed and implemented multiple online interventions and was responsible for the technical implementation of the SWAT and the components of which within the overall study. She's currently managing the overall trial at the moment and the embedded SWAT as part of her responsibilities within the CPR. Stephanie Haugh then is our last panelist. She's a research assistant in the Centre for Pain Research also, and after finishing her BA in English and Maths, she went on to complete a Masters in Medical Statistics. She's also worked in the Centre of Pain Management since 2015 and primarily is focused on research into eHealth. She offers statistical support for a variety of projects within the centre and has a specific interest in network meta-analysis. So before I hand you over to our speakers today, I'll just do a little bit of housekeeping. We're going to run with the presentation and at the end put forward any questions you might have. So if you hover your cursor over the bottom of the page that you're on here now, you should have a toolbar highlighted. And on that toolbar in the middle there is the Q&A section. So if you click on that, type in any questions you have, or you can use the chat part there, and we'll put them to the panel at the end of the session. So without further ado, I hand over to you, Brian.
Okay, thanks. Hello, everyone, and thanks, Vivian. Laura, Stephanie, and I are delighted to talk to you today about our SWAT. By way of background, sorry now, just trying to move the slides.
Got it there.
Yes.
Well done.
Okay. So just by way of background, the host trial is part of a Health Research Board Research Leaders Award awarded to Professor Brian McGuire at the School of Psychology and Centre for Pain Research at NUI Galway. And at the time of the SWAT award, I was the postdoctoral researcher on the award and was the PI for the SWAT. Stephanie was a research assistant on the SWAT, and Laura and Stephanie are currently research assistants at the Centre for Research at NUI Galway and are currently overseeing the host trial. So as an overview, we're going to discuss the following today. So the background to the host trial, the host trial design, background to the SWAT design and the timeline, creating the video, embedding the video, example clips, the procedure, the SWAT procedure, preliminary data analysis, reflections, lessons learned, and tips. And at the end of our presentation, we're very happy, obviously, to take questions and have a chat about the SWAT or indeed any matters that you have. And just to say that the trial itself, the host trial and the SWAT are actually finishing up, hopefully at the end of this month. Okay. So, and again, sorry. Again, just a little bit of a background here. The title of the SWAT was Examining the Influence of an Informational Video on Participant Retention in a Randomised Controlled Trial. And the team that contributed to the SWAT were myself, and we co-applicants were Brian McGuire, Ms. Claire Clement, Dr. Jenny McSherry, and the collaborators and research staff were Stephanie Haugh and Mr. O'Connor. And the host trial, as I said, it is being conducted at the Centre for Pain Research, and it's hopefully finishing up by the end of this month. So just some background then on the main trial and the context of it. So multimorbidity is defined as the coexistence of two or more chronic conditions where one is not necessarily more central than the others. Traditionally, medicine has taken a single disease approach to the management of chronic conditions. However, researchers and healthcare providers suggest that such an approach to disease management is becoming increasingly untenable as greater numbers of people present with multiple conditions. And in fact, as some note, multimorbidity is now considered the norm rather than the exception in primary care patients. And some acknowledge that managing multimorbidity, is the most important task facing healthcare services. So prevalence estimates of multimorbidity vary from country to country. And recent research in Australia has suggested that approximately 25.5% of the population live with multimorbidity. Scotland, 23.2%. And in Ireland here, research has shown at 45.3%. Indeed, prevalence rates of multimorbidity vary between subsets of different populations and are often found to be higher for those people who attend medical services. For example, Fortin and colleagues found that 90% patients in primary care in Canada had one or more conditions, while in an Irish study, it was 2011, 66.2% of patients in primary care had multimorbidity. Chronic pain then is defined as an unpleasant sensory and emotional experience associated with actual or potential tissue damage, or describe a patient in such terms. And it persists typically for a period in excess, or it persists for to be diagnosed as such in excess of 3 months. It's a major public health problem that can have debilitating physical, emotional, psychological, and financial consequences. And prevalence estimates for chronic pain vary. However, a study again in 2011 showed that 35.5% of the Irish population were living with chronic pain. So chronic pain is highly correlated with multimorbidity and is consistently identified as one of the most common conditions in those identified and people with or identified as having multimorbidity. So in a Canadian study that examined the prevalence of disease combinations, 16 common disease pairs were identified with chronic pain appearing in 6 of these, and further from the 5 most common disease triads identified in the same study, chronic pain was involved in 3 of these combinations. So then just on to in terms of background of the trial itself, the host trial, and what we were looking at. So traditionally, CBT or cognitive behavioural therapy is frequently used when a psychological treatment or intervention is required as part of a multidisciplinary rehabilitative process for people with chronic conditions, and has been employed widely, for example, with people who live with chronic pain. And although CBT-based treatments are effective with many different types of conditions or disorders, it's not the case for all. So as a result, research has investigated the effects of other psychotherapeutic approaches, and recently acceptance and commitment therapy has been gaining support. So whereas CBT focuses on the reduction of symptom-related distress, ACT, or acceptance and commitment therapy, ACT, promotes psychological flexibility. So the ability to engage with the present moment in a way that facilitates long-term values and eventually, hopefully, behavioural change. So from this perspective, or from the perspective of ACT, increasing psychological flexibility for a person with a chronic condition is a multi-step process established by 6 core principles. So acceptance of all experiences, both positive and negative, recognition of core personal values, committed action towards those values, psychological diffusion, emphasis on the present moment, and a sense of self as context. ACT has been used as a psychological intervention to improve functioning and quality of life for people living with numerous chronic conditions, including depression, diabetes, cancer, post-traumatic stress, and chronic pain. So traditionally, psychotherapeutic interventions such as ACT have been administered face-to-face when a client meets with a therapist. And this face-to-face approach is subject to numerous constraints, including direct, indirect costs, high labour demands, long waiting lists, mobility and accessibility issues, and shortages indeed in appropriately trained healthcare professionals. So the provision of one-to-one therapy is potentially not feasible for wider scale health interventions. So to negate these limitations, researchers have begun to administer these psychological or psychotherapeutic interventions online. And these programs provide a somewhat standardized psychological treatment over the internet, and are promising in their cost effectiveness and accessibility as results have shown them to be efficacious. So with that said, eHealth refers to the deployment of digital technologies in the context of healthcare or research. And these, there are various different forms of technologies in eHealth, like internet interventions, web applications, mobile applications, virtual reality, augmented reality. So the current trial and the SWAT that we're talking about today refer to a web-based intervention that's typically used on a desktop or a laptop. So people can access the intervention via mobile, but it's not designed specifically for that purpose. So I suppose just on that point, it was key to demonstrate that people who are going through the study and indeed the SWAT are in I suppose, a very sensitive and tough position, and we're motivated, we would expect, to participate and go through the trial. So in terms of the host trial and the intervention and what we were looking at, and these were kind of the restrictions I suppose we had when we developed our SWAT in some ways, but the design was a single blind randomized controlled trial comparing the effect of an internet delivered ACT intervention with a waitlist control, looking at pain interference and health related quality of life for people with multimorbidity, where chronic pain was one of these conditions. The intervention was delivered in an online format, and so participants could complete the intervention in their own homes or on their own time. In terms of inclusion criteria, so there were adults, at least people aged at least 18 years or over, who had the presence of 2 or more chronic conditions, including chronic pain, reported by the patient, and as having been diagnosed by a doctor. And obviously they needed access to a computer, tablet, the internet, and they were not currently undergoing any form of psychological treatment. There was other criteria too. The experimental condition or the treatment consisted of 8 sessions over an 8-week period, and the program was delivered kind of via an interactive online web-based platform, and consisted of information, so educational information, homework assignments, relevant metaphors and mindfulness exercises and so forth. The aim really of the treatment was to increase psychological flexibility by developing kind of acceptance and present focused awareness and engagement in this kind of value-based actions, which would lead to behavioral change. So we really needed people to, I suppose, obviously participate in the trial, but engage with the material meaningfully. And I think that was a key thing in how and why we designed our SWAT, which we'll come to. In terms of participant contact then, over the course of the trial, participants in the experimental group receive an automated weekly email reminder just to prompt each session. And adherence to the intervention then is monitored through basically login data, seeing whether if someone comes in or comes out. So there's no clinician contact, and the program is self-guided, with researchers only contacting participants, to prompt if they fall behind or if they get this email prompt. So I suppose, as this is a pure eHealth intervention without, i.e., like little or no researcher and participant contact, it was for these reasons we were sort of worried about participant retention within our trial in particular. Okay, so yeah. So just another little bit of a background. So we completed a pilot study, and it was recently, in terms of this, and it kind of feeds into the narrative, or I suppose, of the timeline of our SWAT. So we completed a pilot study, 32 people expressed interest, 16 were randomized, and of those people, actually, only 9 began, but of those people that began, there was 9 completions, 5 in the experimental and 4 in the control groups. All 5 of the experimental group who completed the post questionnaire indicated they would recommend the program or our intervention to others, were happy with the content and the presentation of it. Some minor adjustments were suggested, including changes to things, content in the actual intervention, metaphors, background images, and volumes of the various audio components. And as we can see from just some of the data on your right hand side of your screen as you're looking at it, the outcome measures that the experimental control demonstrated improvements relative, I suppose, to the control condition. So following the suggested adjustments to the intervention, we began to work on the SWAT. And I suppose what we wanted to convey from this slide was that we were happy with the development of the host trial and the initial phases of the RCT, but retention was still an issue. And in addition, and I will come back to this later, but the timing of the SWAT resulted, which is key, I think, from the opportunity to conduct a SWAT rather than a predetermined plan to embed a SWAT. So this wasn't possibly an ideal way of developing or including a SWAT. So just as moving into then the rationale behind our SWAT. So retention rates within RCTs in general can be problematic, irrespective of the medium that they're delivered, so face-to-face or online, for example. And indeed, multiple studies have been found that retention rates for RCTs are problematic. And when Smith and colleagues established the trial's methodological research agenda in 2014, the results from their priority setting exercise with methodological experts across clinical trial units found that, or highlighted that, minimizing attrition isn't considered one of the top 3 expert priorities. So moreover, within psychological interventions then, where double blinding is quite difficult, we see higher levels of drop off in the control conditions, because people see they're in control, they're not in the kind of active treatment arm, and they'll know that they're not there, so they might drop off. And in turn, we also know that interventions delivered without person-to-person contact, so in eHealth interventions, have higher levels of attrition, because people are possibly not motivated, or something is keeping them there. And as an aside, we've conducted a different trial from the CPR with higher levels of clinician engagement, and we found the attrition rate and the retention of participants in the trial incredibly high. So because this was an purely eHealth research project, we were concerned. So for these reasons, we were concerned that attrition could be a problem and could jeopardize potentially the validity of the host trial. So as a result, we wondered whether we could employ a study within a trial, a SWAT, to impact the retention levels. So in light of these concerns and insights, the current SWAT study was developed to test the hypothesis that an informational video explaining the structure, the purpose, and clinical benefit of RCT could increase participant retention. So the SWAT itself was a 2x2 design: intervention with and without video, and control with and without video. Once recruited, participants were randomized to one of 4 groups. So those in the video groups were given access to a video explaining aspects of a randomized control trial, and stressing the importance of retaining participants with particular in terms of the weight list control group. The dependent variables, as you can see, so we have our 4 conditions there. The dependent variables were RCT knowledge, total completions, and total sessions completed. The total knowledge was measured between the experimental and control groups, and acted as also as a sort of manipulation check to see if participants had actually watched the video and understood what was going on. And you can see on the right hand side then we had different comparisons. So we can see that the experimental video was compared to the control video on RCT knowledge. The experimental video was compared to the control video on total completions. And then we had, within groups, we had the treatment group was the experimental video versus the control video on total sessions, because we could actually, this is the only group that could be compared on total sessions. And then equally, we had the same for total completions. For total completions. So then our hypotheses were across trial arms. Our first hypothesis was that the total RCT knowledge, which was kind of doubled up as a manipulation check, would be higher in the experimental video condition than those in the control video condition. The second hypothesis was that total completions at time 1 and time 2 in the experimental video condition would be higher than those in the control video. And then within the host trial arms, we were looking at hypothesis 3 was the participants in the experimental video condition will complete more sessions than those in the control video condition. And total completions in the for hypothesis 4, total completions in the experimental video condition would be higher than those in the control video condition within the RCT experimental group. And finally, hypothesis 5, total completions in the experimental video condition will be higher than those in the control video condition within the RCT control group. So just then, in terms of the timeline, I think this is really important, and certainly for the reflections on our SWAT. You can see here in front of you a Gantt chart highlighting the planning and overall timeline of our study, or of our SWAT, as it had been designed, embedded, and implemented. The timeline does not map directly onto specific units of time, but rather gives you an indication as to the scheduling of tasks relative to each other. From the Gantt chart, you can see the SWAT was designed after the RCT pilot had begun, and indeed the SWAT was awarded. So we, as I said in a previous slide, we weren't planning a SWAT, I suppose, from the outset. We had gone through the design of the RCT, we'd started to pilot, and then we knew there was issues with retention, and we were considering a SWAT at that point. But then there was the opportunity through the HRB-TMRN to embed a SWAT because of the SWAT award. So we took that opportunity. So we actually started to design it at that point in time. So as I said, we'll come back to this later, but ideally you don't want to retrofit a SWAT into a trial because it restricts you in terms of what you can do, for example, procedure-wise, design-wise, from an analytical perspective, sample size, different things like that. But we'll come to that, I guess, later on when we have reflections and considerations. So I'll pass you over to Laura now, who's going to talk about creating the video.
Great, thanks, Brian. So yeah, I'm going to take you through basically the creation of the materials and how they were embedded within the host trial as well. So to start off with, we had to start off with what was actually going to appear in our video. So we had known from previous work that we wanted to do basically information around randomised control trials and what it means to be a part of one as a participant. So we began with a really loose idea of what might go into a script for a video like that. And this was based on information we had provided to participants in previous trials, some videos we had made previously as well. And we wrote these up as actual scripts. So you can see on the right hand side there, the really bullet pointed version of what we might have started with. And we shared them first of all with the team within the Centre for Pain Research and then out with the co-applicants of the SWAT award as well. And we just went through multiple rounds of revisions until we were happy with the information that we had included. And then once we were happy with the actual information, we had to start storyboarding it out to ensure that it would work as a video. So we knew at this point we were going to be using an animated video, and that obviously gave us a good bit of freedom in what we could do. So we just started planning out how we would break up the content and how that could be represented as different scenes within a video. And some of this was a more creative representation than we might have done if we just had to film it ourselves. So you can see then how we moved to an actual scripted video plus sort of suggestions for the way we were going to represent certain aspects of an RCT. So again, we did the exact same sort of round of revisions with this storyboard with our larger team and the larger SWAT team too. So then we were able to move into actual video development. And like I said, we knew we were doing animations. We used a service called Powtoons, which is sort of an online hosted software. And we purchased a license to this for the time it would take to develop and export the video. And really here our priority was to create something that was going to be engaging, but not over the top or patronizing or, you know, not appropriate for the setting, basically, because this was going to fit in within our host trial. We decided to, like I said, do that in some cases by interpreting some scenes in a less literal way. So you'll see that in some clips that we'll show you later on. And we also found at this stage that our development ended up being a lot more involved than we initially anticipated. We had to decide on a lot of little things that we really wouldn't have known until we entered this phase, like exactly what style we were going to use within the animation. We had to decide that we were going to do a voiceover rather than put text on the screen because we thought that would be more engaging. We then had to obviously record that voiceover and cut it to match the video and keep everything under 3 minutes in length, which again was a decision based on engagement and not supplying too much information. So we really had to do this as rounds of development too. In some cases, it was all three of us crowded around a computer trying to figure out what scene worked best. And in other cases, it was exporting the video, sharing it to everyone who would look at it again and see what they thought of the more finished product. And then we had to do it all over again to do a control video, which thankfully was only about a minute long, but involved pretty much the same process. So once the video was actually at a stage where we were happy with it, we were also working at the same time to figure out exactly where it would be best to fit it within the host trial. So as Brian said, we had a lot of constraints here in terms of the structure. We couldn't actually amend the structure to any great degree because then it would sort of invalidate what we had done in our pilot. So we had to look at where would be appropriate to fit it within the existing stages. So you can see a diagram of the participant flow throughout our study to the side here. And you can see that at the start, there's a lot of pressure on the participants to be filling out questionnaires. So knowing that we were going to incorporate questions into this SWAT meant we wanted to put it in a place that was low burden. We wanted to encourage watching the full video. And we wanted to make sure that the information was also supplied at a relevant time, that it wasn't given too early where there was no context for it, or too late when actually they already had a good idea of what they were doing and didn't really feel they would need to watch it. And then allocation was also a very key thing. So that led us to pick the allocation stage, which we were doing, like most of the rest of the trial, entirely online. So once we had chosen that, that essentially changed our study flow a bit. But as you'll see, it actually only changed the flow for us managing and developing the study. For the participant, they still go through the exact same number of steps, and there's no functional difference to how they progress in the trial. So then that led to another round of decisions and tweaks that we would have to make. In the initial host trial, our allocation stage involved the participant logging onto a website where a custom script that we had developed would ask them to enter their email, and then it would pull out a randomised allocation for them, and we were using block randomisation. So it was between two groups for the treatment and control, and then we had blocks of 4. So we then had to basically work our SWAT into that whole process. So our final conditions essentially moved from 2 to 4. So to do this, we created 4 Lyme surveys as our sort of containers for the SWAT and for the allocation that was going to be presented to the participant, telling them then which group in the host trial they were going to be. This meant that we could ask those questions, which Stephanie is going to go into a bit more detail on in terms of assessing the knowledge of RCTs. And it also meant that we could record a little bit better what people were doing. So our script would record the groups that they were allocated into, and then we could obviously record the answers and record that they had interacted with this section and, you know, been served the video. One thing we didn't really anticipate here was that we had to somehow create a check for whether the people watched the videos. So as we said, the questions involve a manipulation check essentially, but we also wanted to put something on the video that would encourage people to make sure they play it rather than just click straight to the next page. So we put a slight delay on each page of the questionnaire, just to encourage people to not leap immediately to the navigation buttons. That would have been, I suppose, a habit you might have picked up from doing our baseline questionnaire and questions that weren't relevant to you in a certain section. So we basically just amended our code and created links for these 4 surveys instead of for 2 allocation groups. I'm not expecting anyone to actually try and look at the code there, but just it's an illustration of it. Essentially just meant a couple of extra lines of code here and there, but allows us, like I said, a lot more control and a lot more visibility over what people are doing. So I'm gonna just quickly show you some clips from the videos now, and then I'll be handing over to Stephanie. So the first video here, if it works as it should, is a section of the SWAT video.
Research studies in systematic and structured ways. Depending on the aim of the study, researchers will choose a different structure or research design. The research design we are using for our study is known as a randomised control trial. A randomised control trial is considered the best way of testing a new treatment or intervention. An RCT starts by recruiting specific types of people to participate in the study. Usually this means people who live with a certain health condition.
So you'll notice from that video, in comparison to the one I'm about to show you, that we did use our specific trial as a way of setting the context for this. So rather than try and explain the concept of RCTs completely without context, we used the example of ours just to sort of give us some boundaries on the information we were going to provide. And then I should have said as this is the SWAT experimental video. And then the control video is very much focusing on just the experience of taking part. So you'll see what I mean now in a second.
This study is looking at the effectiveness of an online intervention for people with multimorbidity where chronic pain is a feature. The study will be conducted over a number of weeks. We will be in touch with you again about filling in more questionnaires in a few weeks' time. If you have any queries during the research process, please contact the research team at painresearch@nuigalway.ie.
So yeah, we focus a lot more on exactly what the participant is going to do rather than talk about the larger picture of the RCT there. So now that you have a bit of context on that and can sort of picture the experience of taking part, I'm going to just pass you over to Stephanie, who's going to get a bit more into the data and the analysis.
Thanks, Laura. So just before we kick off, it's important to note that the data here is completely preliminary. We basically took a snapshot of the data in late December, and that's what we're looking at today. So it's some of the people who we would have said didn't complete the study may since have completed, and we've also taken an awful lot of people into the study since then as well that won't be included in analysis. So it's important to note, I suppose, just again, these are completely preliminary, and that's what we're looking at. So we have three main measures we're looking at, as mentioned by Brian. So we're looking at total completion. So we basically took this as a binary outcome of yes or no, and it was basically, did you fill in questionnaires at the end of the trial, post-trial? So for the treatment group, it would have been after 8 weeks of receiving the intervention, and for the control group, it was after an 8-week wait. And if you did, we said yes, and if you didn't, it was no. And we basically just used chi-square tests to investigate the relationships there. And we also looked at the total number of sessions completed just within the treatment group. So that was measured on a scale of 0 to 8, so it's basically how many sessions you completed. So it was continuous, and we also looked at knowledge on a continuous basis as well. We were planning originally on using parametric tests, but none of our data was normally distributed, so we ended up using non-parametric measures. The plan in the future, hopefully, is that we're going to reanalyze everything with full data. We're going to look a little bit at some sort of subgroup analyses. Did the video work better for males or females, and so on. We're also quite interested in the idea of if the video does work, can we use it as a dependent variable when we're measuring retention within the main trial. And we're also going to be looking at time 3 data at some point as well. So this is preliminary data analysis. So we had 44 people that were in our RCT treatment group and 49 people that were in our RCT control group. And like Laura said, they were then randomized to receive either the SWAT experimental video or the SWAT control video. So within that, we ended up with 47 people who received the experimental video and 46 who received the control video. We do not have, unfortunately, demographic information based on group yet. We will at some point when we get to the end of the study. But as of right now, all we have is some preliminary host RCT data. And that showed us that at the moment, the average age is roughly 50, and we're expecting around 83% female, which is fairly standard for studies that kind of feature a chronic pain population. So just to have another quick look at the hypotheses as mentioned by Brian, we're looking at 2 that look at the groups that received the experimental video versus the control video, one assessing knowledge and one assessing total completion. And then we're looking at 3 additional videos that are within treatment, and we're looking at the total number of sessions for the treatment group, and then completion within the treatment group and completion within the control group as well. So first we're going to look at the knowledge part of the study, which was assessed a little bit differently. As mentioned by Laura, we looked at this as a manipulation as well as assessing knowledge. So we wanted to make sure that people actually watched the video. So basically what we did was at the end of the video, after they watched it, 5 questions showed up, and they were free text questions. So when we were deciding how we were going to analyze knowledge, we went through a variety of different iterations and different types of questionnaires. We started with true and false questions, and then we looked at multiple choice questions as well. And we were trying to figure out the best way of assessing knowledge while also trying to keep the people still interested. They've, at this stage, completed an awful lot of questionnaires for us, and we didn't want to upset anyone either. In the end, we decided on free text questionnaires because it allowed us to get an unlimited range of answers from people. it gave them participants an opportunity to expand or clarify their answers rather than feeling like they had to stick with a strict number of words. It also gave us clearer insights into how well they actually understood. There was a little bit more thought required on their part as well, rather than simply clicking a button. There's less guesswork required on their part. We were able to determine a little bit more whether they actually knew what they were talking about. So we had 5 questions that we asked them. We asked them basically, what does an RCT stand for? We asked them if people are put into groups in an RCT, why would we do that, or how do we decide how to put people into groups? We asked what makes the difference between a control group and a treatment group. We asked them at the end of the study how we were looking to find differences between the groups, or what were we hoping to find differences based on. And we also were asking them, why would we use RCTs? So we were basically looking for, an RCT stands for a randomised control trial, that people are put into groups randomly, that the difference between treatment group and control group is the level of treatment that they get, that we'd hope the treatment effect is what causes any differences that would have at the end, and that we'd use an RCT trial in order to effectively determine any differences. So we then coded responses to those knowledge questionnaires and we scored them for correctness. So we scored answers on a scale of 0 to 3, and the scoring was completed in duplicate, and then scores were then circulated within the research team. So an example would be, one of the questions was, what is an RCT? So we would have given 3 points for anyone who said randomized controlled trial, anyone who said randomized control trial. We then offered 2 points for people who would have said things like randomized clinical trial, but if someone came up with something like research controlled treatment, they would have gotten no points. It was, I think, important to note that all of the questions were weighted equally, and we summed them for the participants. So the total scores we then compared between the groups, and it was based on a scale of 0 to 15, which we obviously then considered to be a continuous scale. We did not have any baseline data on the knowledge levels, so knowledge was only assessed at 1 time point. So we're assuming, or we're hoping, that they would have had similar levels of knowledge at baseline, but we have no way of actually determining that. It's the treatment groups, the treatment and control groups of the full RCT do not have any differences in any of the demographic variables at baseline or any of the outcome measures at baseline. So we're hoping that that can all sort of be extrapolated, but it can't really. We don't actually have any idea what their knowledge levels were like at the start, but we were just looking at, were there a difference in knowledge levels after watching the video. We also didn't assess knowledge again post-intervention. There were 2 reasons for that. One is that there was already an awful lot of burden on patients post-intervention. They were completing significant amount of questionnaires. And secondly, that it was possible that people in the treatment group of the host RCT would have gained additional information on RCTs simply by taking part, and that could have confounded the results as well. So the preliminary data analysis of that study, again, was a continuous variable, so it was on a scale of 0 to 15. We ran histograms and they were not normally distributed at all, so we ended up using a Wilcoxon rank sum test. So we had data available for 44 participants for this question, 19 from the RCT treatment group and 25 from the RCT control group, and then another 40 participants who received the control video, 20 from the experimental group and 20 from the control group. So we found that there was a significant difference in knowledge after watching the video, which was quite exciting, although again, we don't have any baseline data, but it's a nice little thing that we figured out anyway. At least the video showed something. It's also worth noting there was no significant difference in knowledge between the RCT treatment and control groups. So it kind of gives us a little bit more of an idea that maybe it was down to the video itself. So looking at hypotheses 2 to 4, which were the ones that were non-free text questions, these ones are a little bit more easy to quantify. So when we're looking at completion, it was just, did you complete, did you return post questionnaires? And when we're looking at total sessions, we're sort of looking at engagement. How many sessions did you actually complete in the study? So for hypotheses 2, 4, and 5, which was looking at total completion, We used a series of chi-square tests to look at the difference in completion rates. None of the p-values from our chi-square tests were significant, although there's a possible trend in the data for hypothesis 5, which was examining the completion rates amongst the people in the RCT control group, where we got a p-value of about 0.4, but with increased sample, it's possible that this could turn into something. For the other outcome, the total number of sessions, the data wasn't normally distributed. So we were looking at the median, and it turns out that the participants that received the treatment and the experimental video completed a median of 3.5 sessions, whereas the people who received the treatment and the control video completed a median of 5.5, which is not particularly promising for our experimental video, unfortunately, but we have more data to collect, you never know. But as of right now, basically, it's not showing a whole lot of promise, although it does increase knowledge, so that's nice. A quick look at the hypotheses again. Basically, we got a significant p-value for did they improve knowledge, although we are considering it also to be just a manipulation checkup. Did they watch the video? But none of our other p-values were significant, unfortunately. But you never know as we run this study again and reanalyze with greater data. Hopefully there'll be something there. So I'm just going to pass back to Brian now for a little bit of wrapping up.
Okay, so thanks, Stephanie. So just in terms of some, I guess, reflections and positives we took away from this. So depending on the nature of your SWAT, so the dependent variable of interest, I mean, you can positively impact the host RCT. So we were looking at a manipulation that could boost retention. And obviously, if it was effective, it could have had a significant impact potentially on our trial. Kind of in a bigger picture idea, you do increase methodological and procedural knowledge, improving methodological efficiencies within maybe your RCT or different RCTs in the future. And there's obviously additional dissemination options that come with that. So obviously presentations, publishing data, and so on. So there are interesting, there's different angles with it. And I suppose these are just the short-term positives that we've thought about as we've discussed it. As I said, we're still progressing. Considerations though, there are definitely additional methodological issues that need to be addressed when you're designing something like this. And as Laura described quite well, you can see the amount of decision making that went into designing something. It started off quite simple, and it snowballed in terms of the amount of decisions we had to make. In the same breath, we were trying to manage and develop our own, the host RCT. Feasibility is an issue. So obviously the complexity of your SWAT will have a significant factor in terms of time and scheduling and so on, and resource constraints. Can you do this? We were lucky within the CPR that we do have a fantastic research team with people with disparate skill sets that could come in together and design and deliver something like this. Obviously there's timing issues as well. So for example, every decision you make, it impacts when, for example, a trial can be, your host trial or potentially the SWAT trial can be conducted. And for us, it happened that the trial itself, when the SWAT was awarded, we waited for the SWAT award. The trial was delayed a little bit. The trial, then we had to change certain things. So it really added to the complexity of what we were doing. So each decision then internally within the SWAT, like the choice of music, the voiceovers, the animations, all that stuff, it just sort of pushed out the timeline a little bit.
Great.
In terms of so lessons, I suppose, learned specifically for a digital intervention or an eHealth intervention, and some of you may be considering a SWAT with an eHealth or digitally delivered intervention. From this perspective of digital intervention, it's quite easy to embed a SWAT because you don't have the same infrastructural issues you might with, say, embedding a SWAT within an RCT, where the intervention being delivered is in a hospital setting, for example, which might have extra considerations, staff, training, and so on, that might impact the fidelity or the host trial and the intervention fidelity, treatment fidelity, and indeed the SWAT, the delivery of the SWAT. So for example, in an eHealth intervention, as Laura highlighted, coding scripts can be written and the SWAT can be embedded quite easily. So it's well worth considering a SWAT like what we had done here in the context of a digital intervention, because the cost, both time and money, are minimal, possibly compared to an in-person intervention. That's not obviously the case across the board, but that's what we found. And additionally, you obviously have to have the technical expertise to embed something like this. So if you were conducting a digital intervention, you probably will have somebody with that ability or capability on your team to deliver that. So it could be useful to do, because the onus is more on the research team to do the work than it is going outward and for participants and so on, or moving into different settings. However, and this is, I suppose, a lesson that we have learned from a digital intervention, and it's a broader, I suppose, consideration. So if you're considering a SWAT and the experimental question involves manipulating something within the main intervention or the digital intervention, you'll need to consider what it means for participants in that sense to actually engage meaningfully in your trial. So, for example, we were looking at the total number of participants who completed and in the trial, and the number of sessions completed, which are typical metrics with standard, I suppose, face-to-face or RCTs of this kind of nature. But just simply turning up the sessions, or retention, in other words, as it's typically described, is not the same as someone actively engaging in the treatment. So I think the concept of engagement, particularly in the idea in the area of digital interventions or eHealth interventions, and I suppose specifically as a lesson learned from us, is quite critical, because it does change. So while the video, I suppose, in this incidence, we're just kind of looking at, as I said, the outcome variables of completions and sessions completed. It might not necessarily mean people have actively really engaged. It might mean that they've just turned up. So we're not sure about that. And then finally, I suppose, just some tips, I guess. So while the SWAT, it's subsumed by host trial, it is a separate research study with its own methodological considerations and research questions. So I would say, and I think the team would all say, seriously consider whether it's worth this additional effort. So are you achieving something with your SWAT that's meaningful and impactful in terms of your current trial, which we would hope to do, or for future trials that you might be conducting? Is it something that you might do? And obviously there's lots of different SWATs out there that could be done. So it might be a neat little study to look at, like efficiencies within a trial. That would be great. And what I would say, and I think this is the main point from what we've conducted here, is that I would obviously plan the SWAT before or alongside the trial, so avoid retrofitting as we have done, because we looked at retention. We knew it could be an issue. We thought it was a chance for a SWAT, but we were actually quite limited then in what we could do. And I guess in some ways it was more opportunistic on our behalf and how we conducted it. But it was really, I would say, designing it and alongside the trial certainly is key. So that's it. I think.
Brilliant.
Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Brian, Laura, and Stephanie. It was really, really helpful. It's really good to get that first-hand experience of it as well, because it's something you might talk about and think about, but not necessarily get an opportunity to talk through with somebody that's already done it. We've had a good few questions coming through. I'll just start in order. The first one from Sinead. She just wanted to ask, has the SWAT protocol been published yet, or will it be?
So I guess I'll jump in there. It hasn't been published. We've registered it. Actually, I'm just thinking we've registered it, but we haven't published the actual protocol itself.
Mm-hmm.
But I guess that's something we consider. We hadn't considered doing that, but that's something we definitely consider. Actually, after today and that feedback from Sinead.
Yeah, that's great. Next one then we have is, can you describe how the ethics approval process went for you, or did you need to get it when you're undertaking the SWAT?
So we actually, ethics approval, because there was slightly different with the digital intervention, we had all our ethics approval done through NUI Galway already for the trial. It wasn't considered within the team that I think we need to go back out for ethics with this particular trial. But obviously if it was something, or this particular SWAT, but if it was something different, I think, and depending on your outcome and what you were trying to do, like in our sense, we were just trying to see if we weren't, I suppose, looking for any people had already gone through, they were already informed about the nature of the study, and we were just providing a little bit of information around it. So we didn't go through ethics in this particular one.
Didn't need further ethics.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Next one then from Anne. She's asking, why did you decide to use a control video as opposed to no video as the control?
So Laura and Stephanie can jump in at any time, by the way, but we didn't use a control video or no video because we wanted to compare to something.
Right.
rather than nothing. And because it could just be said that people got some information. So it was just a sort of an enhanced control condition, really. So people were still getting a video rather than just being, it could have just been the video then that might have had the effect as opposed to the actual content of the video.
Yeah, that's perfect. And then Sean's also says many thanks and wants to know what made you focus on knowledge improvement in the intervention video. And he's asking this because he wasn't sure what the basis of thinking that knowledge was an important barrier to retention in your trial, and so was it worth targeting in the video?
Okay, yeah, well, that's a great question. I suppose we just said, well, as we were thinking about this, we thought that sometimes in the control video, well, first of all, the knowledge actually angle allowed us to have a manipulation check because the questions were quite simple, and they were just, after people had watched the video, we knew if they'd watched it, if they understood it by answering the questions. So that was the kind of one key metric or one key thing. And the second thing was that there was the idea that some understanding of why actually participating in a control condition is important might mean that those people who are randomly assigned to a control condition, because actually in a psychotherapeutic intervention, it's where you see the larger drop off is in the control conditions. They might understand actually I'm in an equally important part or arm of this trial.
Right. Okay, very good. And I had a question myself about, you know, I've discussed this with a few colleagues, and I suppose one of the reservations people have with a SWAT is the idea that it might interfere with the integrity of the host trial. I think you've answered that quite well in the discussion so far anyway, but are there any other recommendations you would give on sort of, I suppose, minding your host trial and making sure that the SWAT, while it was functional and useful, didn't interfere too much in the work you were trying to do in the first place?
I think that's probably one of the hardest. Obviously, that's the biggest thing that you need to do. I mean, the SWAT is subsidiary or second to the actual host trial. So everything you do has to go into the idea that it's not going to have any impact. And I think, as Laura described for us, you know, we put so much effort into figure out where this could actually go that had minimal impact and minimal work. In terms of other considerations, I don't know, Laura and Stephanie, do you have any thoughts on that?
I think personally it was definitely about participant burden, and from looking at the trial and looking at it in ways, so pretty much the point you made, that by looking at where it was going to fit in, I think that gives you a good idea of whether you're going to increase both the burden on the participant and the research team. So I suppose, as we've said, it'd be ideal if you could be looking at integrating a SWAT before you have that structure set, but also just looking at whether your structure is flexible enough if you're looking at retrofitting a SWAT. That it is both providing something to you as a research question, but that it's not fundamentally changing. Like, I think that's really the way you need to look at it. And yeah, it is a tricky one, and it's something that you know, until you have the research question for the host trial and the SWAT sitting side by side and looking at how they integrate together, it is quite hard to answer.
Yeah,
I think, Laura, that's a really good point, because it is quite hard to answer that. You obviously have to make sure that the host trial is safe, but it is when you sit down and go, what do we want to do here, and you compare them side by side, you can see that can anything, it's like mitigating against any risk, can anything here hamper or impede or affect the host trial? And if it does, well, it changes what you can do. So
yeah, that's really great. Well, thank you so much, all three of you, because I think it's really great to get three different perspectives as well on it. So I think it's been a really good session having you all contribute. I just want to mention, there's a paper that the TMRN are promoting to use for anyone that's thinking about implementing a SWAT, and that's one by Professor Sean Tariq. It was published last year in the Trials Journal, and it's Trial Forge Guidance 1, what is a study within a trial, SWAT. And that's really good because it's really relevant for today's, and it gives you really good guidance about putting your SWAT together. So just wanted to kind of promote that, and also use the opportunity as well to promote that we're having Professor Sean Tariq next for our next webinar, which is going to be the 16th of April. So I'll have details about that on Twitter. I think that would help as well for anyone that's thinking about doing it. But it's been absolutely invaluable having you today discussing it, because it's given me loads of information as well, and sort of food for thought of how you could go about using one yourself to the best of your, to get the most out of it. So thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Thanks, everyone.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, great. And we look forward to hearing the results at the end of the trial.
Yep.
And how it went there. So thanks very much, everyone at home, for contributing and all the questions. It was a really great session. So goodbye for now.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.